Every year, older Americans lose more than $3 billion to scams. But this scam didn't come from a stranger. It came from inside the family. It was a quiet morning in suburban Texas. Robert Miller, 72 years old, a retired engineer, poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. He opened his laptop as he did every week to check his retirement account. $700,000, his life's work, his safety for the future. But today, the numbers were gone. His screen showed a balance of zero. Every stock, every bond sold overnight. An email confirmation blinked in his inbox. One sentence, cold and final. All funds transferred to David Miller. Robert stared at the name. David, his eldest son. The coffee cup trembled in his hand. "I never gave that order," he whispered. "I never said that." In less than 24 hours, Robert's entire retirement had vanished. Everything he had built gone. But the cruelest part wasn't the missing money. It was the name attached to the transfer. If it could happen to him, could it happen to your family too? And if you've ever worried about your parents, your grandparents, or even yourself falling victim to something like this, share this story. Leave a comment if you've seen anything similar, or if you feel the same fear. Someone you love might need this warning. Robert Miller was 72 years old, a retired engineer living alone in a modest house on the edge of a quiet Texas suburb. His days followed a rhythm that rarely changed. Each morning he drove to the small diner 2 blocks away, ordered black coffee with 2 sugars, and read the paper from front to back. On Sundays he sat in the second pew at his church, nodding politely to neighbors who had known him for decades. Stability and routine had been his comfort since his wife passed away years earlier. Robert had 2 sons, and they could not have been more different. David, the eldest at 45, lived only a short drive away. He was married, well-dressed, confident, and the kind of man who filled a room with his presence. David had built a successful career in finance, and he carried himself like someone who expected others to recognize it. Robert often admired his son's accomplishments, but there was an edge in David's voice, a tone that sometimes felt more like command than care. Michael, the younger son at 33, lived across the country in California. He was not wealthy. His job in tech support paid the bills, but little more. He lived in a cramped apartment, always a little behind on rent. But what Michael lacked in money, he made up for in devotion. Every week, without fail, he called his father on FaceTime. Sometimes it was just a short conversation about weather or football. Sometimes it was a gentle reminder. "Don't forget your blood pressure pills, Dad." Robert always smiled after those calls. Still, Robert relied more on David for matters of money. 10 years earlier, when he decided to open an investment account at Charles Schwab, David had been the one who filled out the forms and explained the process. Robert had trusted his son's confidence and knowledge, nodding as David pointed at stock charts. At the end of that day, the account was created, the password written carefully on a yellow notepad Robert kept by his landline phone. He never moved it. He never thought he needed to. The account had grown over the years, from careful investments in steady companies to riskier stocks that paid off. $700,000 now sat in that portfolio. It wasn't wealth beyond measure, but it was everything Robert had built after decades of work. It was his cushion, his safety net, his future. Lately, though, Robert had noticed subtle changes in David. When David visited, he spoke with unusual intensity about managing his father's money. "Dad, you don't need to worry about these accounts," he would say, patting Robert's shoulder. "I can take care of everything. You've done enough." His smile was warm, but his eyes lingered on Robert's desk where the notepad rested. Robert brushed off the feeling, telling himself it was simply his son being protective. After all, wasn't that what a son should do that evening? Robert sat back in his recliner, flipping through the financial section of the newspaper. His phone buzzed. Michael's face filled the screen, calling from California. "Hey, Dad." Michael began, his voice urgent. "I just checked something, and it doesn't look right. I was helping you set up those email alerts. Remember, I just saw your latest Schwab statement? Did you sell everything?" Robert frowned, confused. "Sell everything? No, of course not. Why would I do that?" Michael shook his head. "Then something's wrong. Really wrong." Robert leaned back, staring at the framed photo on the wall. It showed the 3 of them years ago at a 4th of July picnic. His wife still alive, David holding a sparkler. Michael grinning with a paper flag in his hand. The memory warmed him. yet it also stung. Those days of laughter felt so far away now. He whispered to himself, "Family is all I have left." And as the phone buzzed again with Michael's call, Robert couldn't shake the chill running through his chest. Something about this moment felt different. Something was about to change. The landline rang before sunrise. Robert answered because landlines were how important news had always arrived. Michael's voice was tight. "Dad, check your account." Robert opened his laptop at the kitchen table, waited for the slow boot, and stared at numbers that did not belong to his life. He called the brokerage. "Charles Schwab Client Services, this is Taylor. This is Robert Miller. My balance is 0. That can't be right." "I'm looking now," Taylor said. "Records show your portfolio was liquidated yesterday. The proceeds were transferred externally." "Transferred to who?" "To David Miller." Robert set the phone down. He could see David in a dozen ages, stubborn and useful, always carrying something. Within an hour, David stood in the doorway, tie-loose briefcase in hand. "Dad, what happened?" "They said the money went to you." David's laugh was thin. "Must be a reconciliation quirk. These systems lag. They said your name." "It was to protect you," David said quickly. "You've wanted out of the market for months." The front door opened again. Michael walked in with a backpack and a face that had not slept. "Tell me it isn't true." "Don't start," David said. "Dad clicks on spam." Michael sat and opened the laptop. "That's not spam, it's a statement." He pulled the security page. "Access logs 8:12 a.m. Log in from here. 9:47 p.m. Log in from your address, David." Robert looked at his eldest. "Did I call you last night? Did I tell you to sell?" David rubbed his forehead. "You've been anxious. Maybe you forgot." "I didn't," Robert said. Michael scrolled. "Password reset 2 weeks ago. Recovery email changed to an address with your initials." He glanced up. "Why I updated it because Dad misses notifications," David said. "He writes passwords on a pad by the phone." "You told me to," Robert said, placing the yellow pad on the table. "You said paper forgets less than people." Michael's phone buzzed. Alerts show a full liquidation and a wire beneficiary, David Miller. "Temporary," David said. "I moved it to a holding account. Safer. I was going to move it back." "Wire it back now," Michael said. "There are settlement periods." Robert had lived long enough to know that the truth doesn't need speed so much as spine. "Michael," he said, "ask the bank and the brokerage for any document they say I signed." For the rest of the morning, they worked a relay of calls. Michael requested trade confirms, transfer records, access logs with IPs and devices, and any authorization letters on file. A secure link arrived. He opened a PDF, a tidy form with boxes checked and a timestamp from last Thursday. At the bottom, Robert's signature smooth, even tireless. Robert leaned close. He had signed his name enough times to recognize its breath. "That isn't my hand," he said quietly. Michael enlarged the image and pulled up scans of old checks. "Your real signature puts weight on the first R and pauses before the double L. This one doesn't." David crossed his arms. "He signed. He forgot." Robert shook his head. "Not this. Metadata says scanned at 3:18 p.m. and uploaded from an outside email," Michael said. The brokerage notes, "A callback verification." "No one called me," Robert said. "Then someone answered your line or spoofed it," Michael said. "I'm requesting the callback audio." He also drove to the diner and asked the waitress about last Thursday. She handed him a receipt at 3:15 p.m. and said, "He left $5. He always does." Michael scanned it and added it to a fresh one-page map reset, recovery changed, letter, callback, evening login, liquidation, wire. At the top, he wrote in block letters, "Method over motive." That afternoon, Sarah King, a local attorney, sat at Robert's table and listened without interruptions. "First, we file an emergency freeze and flag the transfer," she said. "Second, we demand full records. Third, we prepare for court. You mentioned a recording. The broker said there's audio," Michael said. "We've asked for the original. We'll engage a forensic voice expert," Sarah said, "and we'll notify Adult Protective Services. Documentation matters." "I'm not helpless," Robert said. "You're asserting your rights," Sarah answered. David stood by the window. "You're going to smear me." "We're going to follow evidence," Sarah said. "If you didn't do this, you should want exactly that." Before Sarah left that first afternoon, she explained why Adult Protective Services mattered. "It isn't a label," she said. "It's a paper trail that tells future judges you asked for help when you should have and that people listened." Robert nodded slowly. He thought of Eleanor, his wife who had kept every warranty and clipped every receipt, smiling at him when he teased her for it. Paper, remembers she used to say. He could hear her now saying it not as a warning, but as a comfort. He pulled open a drawer and found an old file with her handwriting on the tab. Taxes, and felt for a moment the absurd strength that comes from touching anything that carried someone you loved forward. Evening brought 2 emails, the freeze order granted and a link labeled voice instruction account ending 2147. Michael pressed play. A voice said, "This is Robert Miller. I want to liquidate my positions and transfer the proceeds to David Miller." It sounded right until it didn't. Breath 2, even cadence, too smooth an L in Miller, clipped in a way Robert never clipped. "That isn't me," Robert said. Michael replayed the first 5 seconds and compared them to a Thanksgiving voicemail saved on his phone, human in one, hollow in the other. He sent the file to Sarah with a line, "Forensic analysis needed." The house quieted. Robert moved room to room, touching frames, straightening small things he had already straightened. He didn't cry. He had learned to save that for places where wind could take it away. Michael made tea and set a cup on the table. "Did I fail him?" Robert asked finally. "Did I make him this way?" "You gave us what you had," Michael said. "What we do with it is ours." The next day, Sarah called court schedules, expedited a word that sounded like mercy. They sat in the back of a wood-paneled room and watched the judge keep time with his eyes. The freeze stayed. Production of records was ordered. The audio would be examined by both sides. The authorization letter could be compared to printers identified by subpoena. Back home, Michael taped the schedule beside the 1-page map on the fridge. The map looked small now, a straight line inside a crooked day. Robert sat and stared at the yellow pad, then turned it over and wrote the day's date on the back because writing had always made things real. He signed his name, the pen, pressing a familiar weight onto the first R and taking a breath before the double L. David returned, stubbornness softened by fear. "If the funds are frozen," he said, "we can unwind this. I never meant harm. I hired someone to make approvals smooth. Give us the messages," Michael said. David hesitated, then unlocked his phone and slid it across. Threads scrolled promises of streamlined approvals, mentions of callback, past a smug line about voice if needed. "Who is he?" Michael asked. "A handle," David said. "We met once at a co-working space near my office. He wanted a cut." "Then we go there," Michael said, "with Sarah. But first, more waiting and a call they didn't expect. A new email. No subject, same anonymous address, 1 sentence. You're looking in the wrong house." Attached was a tiny audio clip where the same almost Robert voice glitched on the R and then smoothed out like someone pressing ripples flat. Michael saved it, labeled it, and sent it to Sarah along with the diner receipt, the 1-page map, and a note, "Method over motive." He turned to the old answering machine on the hallway table and pressed play on the greeting Robert had recorded years ago. He heard the warmth in it, and his chest tightened because warmth was what the world tried to steal first. He recorded a copy and added it to the folder with a name that did not pretend it was anything but tender. "Dad landline greeting, Wav." They sat through a quiet evening the way you sit through a slow rain. Letting it happen, because there's nothing you can do to stop it, and everything you can do to be ready when it ends. Robert looked older and somehow more himself. "They took my money," he said at last. "But they broke my heart first." Michael didn't offer a fix. "We'll put the money back," he said. "The heart takes longer." He stood, turned off lights, and left the kitchen the way he wanted to leave it in his memory, a table, a folder, a map with arrows pointing forward, and a father asleep in a chair breathing the way real people breathe, uneven, alive. Michael woke before sunrise, mind humming with unfinished questions. He brewed coffee in Robert's kitchen and opened the laptop while his father buttoned a clean shirt with slow, careful hands. At 7, they called the brokerage. "This is Taylor," the rep said. Michael explained what they needed: full trade confirmations, any authorization letters, and the complete security access logs. Taylor's voice was steady. "I'll send a secure link. There is an authorization on file allowing a named party to place instructions, signed by Mr. Miller." Robert's mouth tightened. "I didn't sign anything." The link arrived. Michael opened a PDF, A neat form checked boxes a timestamp from last Thursday afternoon, and Robert's signature at the bottom, smooth and confident, as if written by a hand that never shook. "I never signed this," Robert whispered. Michael scrolled to the metadata panel, scanned and uploaded at 3:18 p.m. from an outside email he read. "They say they verified by callback. No one called me," Robert said. Michael requested the callback record, then opened the access logs. 2 logins yesterday, he said, one from here at 8:12 a.m. and one from David's address at 9:47 p.m. There's also a password reset 2 weeks ago and a change to your recovery email replaced with an address that matches David's initials. Robert's hands nodded. "He told me to write my passwords down, said it was safer than forgetting them." They went straight to a local attorney. Sarah King, who listened, took notes, and spoke with the clarity of someone who had guided too many families through storms like this. "First preservation," she said. "We seek an emergency freeze on the transferred funds. Second, production. I'll demand all records from the bank and brokerage, including the audio of any phone instructions. We will also file with Adult Protective Services to document potential elder financial exploitation." Robert raised his chin. "I'm not helpless." Sarah held his gaze. "No, sir, you're asserting your rights." Back at the house, Michael compared the signature on the authorization letter with Robert's real signatures on checks on a birthday card on the mortgage release he'd found in an old folder. Robert's lines had quirks of weight on the first R, a breath of space before the double L. The PDF signature was too even, too clean. "Like a stamp," Michael said. "Not a pen." David called that afternoon. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "You're scaring Dad." "I'm scared because the money is gone," Robert replied, "not because of questions." David came over. He didn't sit down. "Dad, you've been talking for months about getting out of the market. You panic when it dips. I moved the funds to protect you, protect me by taking them. I was going to move them back. There are settlement periods. I needed them out of harm's way." Michael nodded at the laptop. "Wire them back now." David bristled. "You can't order me around." He pointed at the notepad. "You leave your password on a table. Anyone could take it. I did what a responsible son would do." Robert's voice found iron. "A responsible son would ask." David looked at Michael as if the room itself had tilted. "He lives across the country and plays hero on FaceTime. I'm the one who's here." Michael didn't argue. "We've requested the phone audio. If you gave the order, we'll hear it." David's stare darted to the door. "You two want to fight? Fine. You'll get one." He left. That evening, Sarah called. The emergency freeze had been granted. The funds couldn't move without a court say-so. She also forwarded a download link from the brokerage voice instruction account ending 2147. Michael clicked play. A voice said, "This is Robert Miller. I want to liquidate my positions and transfer the proceeds to David Miller." The cadence was right. The words were right. The feel was wrong breath at even lengths, a clipped L in Miller Robert had never clipped in his life. Robert stared at the speaker. "That isn't me." Michael replayed the opening seconds and compared them with a saved voicemail where Robert had asked about Thanksgiving. The mismatch was subtle, but real human in one, hollow in the other. He sent the file to Sarah with a line, "Forensic voice analysis needed." She replied. 5 minutes later, she had engaged Dr. Elaine Porter, an audio authenticity expert. Michael forwarded Dr. Porter several of Robert's voicemails and a new recording of Robert reading from the paper. While they waited, Michael re-examined the authorization PDF. Faint dotting across the margin looked like microprint artifacts, tiny machine signatures printers leave behind. "Fingerprints on paper," he told Robert. "If this came from a device at David's, a subpoena can match it." Dr. Porter's preliminary opinion arrived before dinner. The audio displays anomalies consistent with voice synthesis, Michael read. Uniform sibilance, unnatural breath noise, and formant transitions that do not align with human articulation under emphasis. In common language, it sounds like Mr. Miller, but it doesn't behave like a human voice. Robert exhaled equal parts relief and grief. "Someone wore my voice like a mask." Sarah called on speaker. "This strengthens our position. We'll argue the brokerage failed to verify identity. If they relied on this alone, they shouldn't have." "They claim they did a callback," Michael said. "Then we request that record Sarah answered. If the number was spoofed, we show it. If a different person answered, we show that too. Judges like timelines and hard edges." The next morning, the callback log arrived. The number matched Robert's landline. The time matched the afternoon the authorization was uploaded. Michael played the recording. It was brief. A rep asked for confirmation. The same almost Robert voice replied, "Yes, this is me." The line clicked. Robert shook his head. "I was at the diner at 3:15. I remember the clock. The waitress refilled my coffee and asked if I wanted pie. They drove to the diner," the waitress remembered. "You left a $5 tip," she said, smiling sadly. "You always do." A time-stamped receipt went into Michael's folder. Back home, Michael drew the timeline on a single-page password reset, recovery email change, authorization uploaded, callback to landline spoofed, evening login from David's address, liquidation and transfer. Under it, he wrote in block letters, "Method over modotative." Court was set 2 days later. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Sarah went over the order of proof. "We start with the numbers," she said, "then the letter, then the logs, then the audio." She looked up. "Let the defense talk about feelings. We talk about facts." Inside, Judge Harris listened without rushing. The bank's attorney submitted the authorization letter. The brokerage provided access logs. David's lawyer argued that a concerned son had acted to protect an anxious, aging father. "Protection doesn't hide its tracks," Sarah said. She played the audio. Even in a quiet courtroom, even to ears untrained, the voice had a thinness that felt wrong. Sarah handed up Dr. Porter's report, translated its findings without jargon, and then displayed a simple chart: morning logins from Robert's IP, evening logins from David's, a password reset from a new Windows desktop registered weeks earlier. "This isn't memory," she said. "It's math." Judge Harris spoke when the exhibits were done. Funds remain frozen. The court orders production of callback routing data device information for the scanned letter and a joint forensic exam of the audio by both parties' experts. "We will proceed on an accelerated schedule." He looked at Robert. "Mr. Miller, we will try to get you answers quickly." Outside, the air felt wider. 2 neighbors from church had come. "We're praying for you," one said, and Robert squeezed back, grateful for a sentence that did not require proof. That night, Michael sat at the kitchen table after his father fell asleep and wrote a list titled, "What We Still Don't Know." Who made the fake call, from who created the letter? Did David act alone? He added another line and circled it twice. Who benefits if father and sons never speak again? He called David and asked to meet in the old park. David came with anger tucked under his coat. "Get your lists and your charts out of my life," he said. "You're burning this family down." "You hired someone," Michael said, who David stared at the court where they had once learned to catch bounce passes. "I thought he'd clean up paperwork, that's all. I didn't ask for voices." He talked about streamlining, said he could simulate approvals if banks were slow. "Name, I don't have it." He used a handle. "We met once in a co-working space near my office. He wanted a cut. When I hesitated, he threatened to make it look like I did everything." David looked suddenly smaller. "Maybe he already has." Messages, Michael said. David handed over his phone. Michael copied the threads and returned it. "The only way out is through," he said. "Cooperate. Return the funds. Tell the truth." "I already told the truth," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Later at home, an email arrived from an unknown address. No subject, no body. Just an attachment and a single line. "You're looking in the wrong house." The file was a short audio clip. The same, almost Robert voice, but for a second it glitched the R in Robert buckling before settling. Michael forwarded it to Sarah and Dr. Porter with a note, "Anonymous tip. Possible source." He leaned back and looked at his father sleeping in the armchair, the blanket pulled to his chin. The methods were clearer now: forged letter, spoofed callback, synthetic voice logins, mapped like footprints. The motive remained a locked door. Michael closed the laptop and whispered into the dim room, "We're not done." Robert paused in the hallway and let the courthouse air settle. Michael stood beside him with the one-page timeline Sarah had drilled into them, numbers, letter logs, audio. "Method over motive," she said. "Let the facts talk." They entered. Judge Harris took the bench. 2 friends from church sat in the second row. Sarah began without drama. In one day, Mr. Robert Miller's retirement portfolio was liquidated and wired to an external account under the name of his son, David Miller. We will show the money trail, an authorization letter. Mr. Miller denies access logs from David Miller's home, and a recorded phone instruction that sounds like Mr. Miller but is not human. Exhibit A. Trade confirmations for a full liquidation. Exhibit B. The wire record naming David Miller. Robert breathed evenly. David studied the table. Exhibit C, Sarah said, lifting a page an authorization letter bearing Mr. Miller's signature. She turned to Robert. I didn't sign that, Robert said. It looks like my name, not my hand. Sarah faced the bench. Printers and scanners leave microscopic patterns, fingerprints on paper. We will compare this scan to devices identified by subpoena. Foundation, later the judge said. Proceed. Exhibit D. Sarah said, pointing to a single-page chart. Security logs. An 8:12 a.m. login from Mr. Miller's home. A 9:47 p.m. login from David Miller's address. 2 weeks earlier, a password reset and a recovery email changed to an address with David's initials. The clerk played the audio. This is Robert Miller. I want to liquidate my positions and transfer the proceeds to David Miller. The cadence was close enough to make the room hold its breath. That is not my voice, Robert said. Taylor, the brokerage representative, explained procedures, identity questions, a callback, a record, on spoofing. Possible, Taylor said. If answers match and the number appears correct, our system passes the call. And if the number appears correct but is not? Sarah asked. We're updating procedures, Taylor said. Dr. Elaine Porter took the stand. I compared the disputed audio with reference samples, she said. Human voices have small irregularities, like a heartbeat. In the disputed file, sibilants are uniform, vowel transitions are too smooth under emphasis, and the L in Miller is clipped in a way never present in Mr. Miller's recordings. In plain terms, Sarah asked, it's highly consistent with voice cloning, Dr. Porter said. It sounds like him but doesn't behave like a human voice. David's attorney tested the edges. Not definitive. I'm cautious, Dr. Porter said, but the pattern is not probable in natural speech. The attorney turned to Robert. You keep passwords on a pad by your telephone? Yes, Robert said. My son told me to write them down. Do you forget things? I remember the important things, Robert said, including a tip at the diner last Thursday at 3:15. Sarah presented the receipt. The judge admitted it. Judge Harris folded his hands. Interim orders, the funds remain frozen. The bank and brokerage will produce callback routing data and caller ID authentication. A forensic comparison of the scanned authorization is authorized under chain of custody. The audio will be jointly examined by experts. We reconvene on an accelerated schedule. He glanced at Robert. We will move with appropriate speed. Outside, church friends squeezed Robert's hands. Back home, Sarah spread papers on the kitchen table. Reset, recovery, change, authorization, callback, evening, login, liquidation, transfer, she said. We have a straight line. Now we sand edges. Doctor. Porter wants the raw, uncompressed audio, Michael added. She needs the original file. And the anonymous clip, Sarah asked. Michael played the short file from an unknown address. The R in Robert wavered, then smoothed. A faint hiss undercut the voice. She thinks the glitch points to training audio, he said. If she isolates it, she can estimate the engine. Robert rubbed his temples. 10 years ago, I fixed my own car, he said. Now someone fixes a voice. You fixed what mattered, Michael said. You showed up. Sarah gathered copies. I'm notifying Adult Protective Services. It documents potential elder exploitation and increases leverage. I don't want to be a case, Robert said. You're a person, Sarah replied. Cases help courts remember people they can't meet all at once. They worked all afternoon. Michael condensed facts to one page, what they had, what they needed, what was missing. At the bottom he wrote, Why this method? Why now? He left it blank. Near dusk, Michael called David. Meet me. 10 minutes. The old park. David arrived tense. I'm not confessing, he said. I'm asking for help, Michael replied. I helped, David said. Dad can't stand market dips. I moved money to protect him. You kept him from asking. Michael said, That's different. You don't live here, David said. You don't see the stove left on or the pills forgotten. He calls me, Michael said. He wants dignity, not a guardian. Dignity won't buy medicine in a crash. Neither will theft, Michael said. David's eyes fell. Lower, I hired someone to clean up paperwork, to smooth approvals. I didn't ask for a fake voice. Give me the messages, Michael said. Let us help you tell the truth. David hesitated, then handed over his phone. Back home, Michael forwarded the threads to Sarah. We'll get a court order to identify whoever sits behind this handle, she said. If they used a co-working space, there will be log. Robert turned an empty teacup slowly. I taught him to change a tire, he said, to check the oil. to never take what wasn't his even if no one would notice. He heard some of it, Michael said. Not all. Dr. Porter emailed again, 3 anomalies, breath spacing 2, even a formant shift that ignored consonant pressure, a spectral seam where phrases were machine-spliced. With the original high-resolution file, she wrote, we can likely reach a conclusive classification. Sarah filed a motion for the raw audio pre-processing logs and callback routing metadata citing guidance on biometric verification and synthetic media fraud. Judges like knowing other courts have faced the same problem, she told Michael. It makes decisions feel less lonely. Next morning, the clerk set a sooner hearing. The bank's compliance team flagged the transfer and agreed to cooperate. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. That shifts leverage. Robert breathed out. I'd like my money back, he said finally. You'll get it, Michael said. Belief, he decided, could be a discipline. That afternoon, Sarah brought affidavits. Robert signed statements that he had not authorized the letter, had not made the call, had not changed the recovery email. He signed carefully, the same weight on the first R, the same pause before the double L, human rhythms that cannot be stamped. When the sun dropped, David texted, "You're tearing this family apart." Michael erased 3 replies and sent 1. The truth is doing the tearing. We're trying to mend. After dark, the house grew quiet. Robert said, they stole my money, but they broke my heart first. We'll put the money back, Michael said. The heart takes longer, but we're not giving it away. Robert managed a small smile. You're stubborn. I learned it here, Michael said. The next day brought 2 things: callback routing that suggested caller ID spoofing, and a letter from Adult Protective Services acknowledging the report. Robert read a pamphlet on financial scams and frowned. I never thought I'd be the example, he said. You're the warning, Michael said. Warnings save people. Late afternoon, Dr. Porter called again. The anonymous clip and the disputed call share a synthetic timbre, she said. The glitch on Robert likely comes from a low-quality training sample later smoothed. If we can locate training audio, the original clips they fed the system, we can tie source to use. Where would they get training audio, Robert asked. Anywhere your voice is public, Michael said. Voicemails, your landline greeting, the church live stream where you read last spring. He copied the greeting and added it to the folder. Tender things can still be evidence. As night settled, Sarah texted, FBI intake tomorrow afternoon. Bring the timeline. And Michael wrote back, on it, and tightened the 1-page map until it could tell the story without him. The day had been long. The road ahead would be longer, but for the first time since he had stared at a zeroed-out account, Robert felt his footing return. The court had seen him. The records were speaking. The voice that was not his had been named for what it was. He looked at Michael. Thank you, he said. You don't have to thank me, Michael replied. I do, Robert said, because you asked before you took. They sat until the clock marked the hour with a soft, ordinary sound. Outside, porch lights blinked on. Inside, a father and a son kept to the method they could trust, one step then another. The truth laid out on the table like tools ready for work. Robert sat at the kitchen table with Michael's 1-page timeline, reset, recovery change authorization, callback, evening, login, liquidation, wire. The story looked neat on paper and messy everywhere else. Let's go, Michael said. They met Special Agent Cole at a federal office that smelled like paper and cold air. Cole listened, eyes on the single sheet. Elder fraud with synthetic media, he said. We'll need originals, raw audio, SIPI logs, caller ID authentication, chain of custody for what you've collected. Sarah joined by phone. Subpoenas are in motion for a co-working space tied to a handle David interacted with. Cole looked at David. You hired an outside consultant. David nodded. For paperwork, not for voices. Messages, payments where you met him, Cole said. Michael passed over forwarded threads. Handle resolves to a co-working space near David's office. Cole set out the plan like a mechanic. Preserve, collect, compare, corroborate. He slid evidence bags across the table. If you remember any device with your voice answering machines, bag it. Back home, Dr. Elaine Porter called. I found probable training sources, she said. Your father's landline greeting and a church live stream from last spring. The sanctuary's reverb fingerprint faintly imprints the model's output like flour on a baker's hands. Robert winced. I read to help. It isn't on you, Michael said. Sarah arrived with a thin, purposeful smile. The court approved subpoenas. The co-working space will produce room bookings, printer queues, and lobby camera footage. 2 days later, they sifted records under lamplight. A small room had been booked the afternoon the authorization was uploaded by a member using the alias Avery Knox. Camera stills showed a man in a cap. Printer logs listed a PDF spooled at 3:11 p.m. Network logs recorded a USB headset connected at 3:14. Test runs, Michael said. For the callback or for voice output? Cole called. SIP routing shows the callback token failed authentication, but the system passed it because the number string matched. Source node, a VoIP reseller 2 floors below the co-working space. The room's network and the call share the same building footprint. Robert closed his eyes. Not my house, not my son's house, not your house, Cole repeated. David's shoulders dropped. He didn't speak. Sarah slid a document toward him. Sworn statement. You admit hiring an outside consultant to streamline approvals. Deny the synthetic call, agree to cooperate, and return any funds you control. David read, then looked at his father. If I sign, will you forgive me? I know what defense looks like, Robert said. I will defend my family and my name. David signed. Cole's affidavit produced quick warrants. Agents boxed routers, cloned drives, and photographed a whiteboard approval SIM callback pass layer voice skin. A receipt led to a row of lockers across the street. Inside a Pelican case sat a travel laptop, a USB audio interface, and a label printer. On the laptop, analysts found synthesis scripts and configs, breath-level cadence map, and short tests where a neutral voice slowly learned Robert's vowels. One WAV file labeled Church Read carried the same faint echo Dr. Porter had noted. Another folder held composite signatures overlaid into a line built to stamp. He practiced on my father, Michael said. He practiced until my father fit. Cole briefed them on a controlled call. No threats, no promises, he told David. You let him talk. If he asks for a fee to simulate approvals or mentions voice, we move. David called the handle. A pleasant voice answered. You mean, clean up your Boy Scout brother's mess? I need funds returned, David said. Clean costs, the voice replied. Your bank is spooked. We'll need to use voice again, different path. Easiest if the old man records a line. Otherwise I can stretch the model. Cole underlined a word on his pad voice. He stopped the recording. That's enough. Warrants turned into visits. Visits turned into boxes. Boxes turned into files experts combed for edges. By evening, the outlines had shifted. The evening login from David's address could be explained by a laptop catching David's Wi-Fi from the curb. Printer artifacts on the letter matched a device in the co-working suite. SAPE logs tied the callback to the reseller downstairs. David's name remained on the wire. The method no longer lived in his walls. At Sarah's office, Cole laid the pieces in order. We have probable cause on the alias Avery Knox, he said. Real identity pending. The U.S. attorney will decide charges, but the patterns there forge signature pipeline, spoofed callback, synthetic voice instruction, and a laundering path through a holding account. Robert listened, jaw set but calmer. What happens to the money? We'll pursue clawback and restitution, Sarah said. The freeze remains, and with this record, the court will tilt your way. Robert nodded. I want the truth on paper. You're getting there, Cole said. Family air eased, not warm but breathable. No one used the word forgive. No one used the word blame. Michael printed a revised timeline and wrote a new header, method not rumor. That night they sat at the kitchen table, 3 points finally forming a shape instead of a collision. Tomorrow, Robert said, we return what can be returned. We will, Michael said. David lifted his eyes. I'll testify. I'll sign whatever the court needs. I'm sorry. Robert gave a single nod. We see this through. Michael's phone chimed. An email from the same anonymous address contained one line. It wasn't just about the money. An attachment followed an access log from the church's content system showing a download of last spring's live stream. The flag indicated a volunteer account had pulled the clip. The username was familiar, a friend who sat 2 pews behind Robert every Sunday. Michael felt that quiet tilt again, the kind that redraws the map of trust more than it moves the furniture. He turned the screen so his father could see. We may be looking in the right house now, he said, just not the one we thought. The email sat between them like a small bright fuse. Michael opened the attachment fully. The log wasn't flashy, just a table of times and usernames. But one column mattered: device fingerprint. The same fingerprint had appeared in the co-working network capture 2 days earlier, a laptop that hopped from public buildings to borrowed rooms. "That laptop moves," Michael said. It watched the church stream, then showed up in the co-working suite. Sarah leaned in. "We'll get a preservation order to the church and a subpoena for volunteer access records." Quietly. "No public ripples unless the court makes them." Robert looked down at his hands. "He shook my hand last Sunday," he said, naming the volunteer softly. "He asked after my back." "People speak kindly while they take," Sarah said, not unkindly. "That's why paper is our friend." Cole called back with updates from the lab. "We matched the printer microdots on the authorization to the co-working device," he said. "This actor harvested signatures from whatever the world left lying around." Robert exhaled. "I thought caution meant locking my front door," he said. "I didn't know it meant locking the places I never visit. It means writing fewer things the world can copy," Michael said, then caught himself. "I don't mean silence. I mean awareness." "And allies," Sarah added. "You have those." Michael made tea and set 3 cups on the table. He printed a new map and clipped it to the folder. He added a small note at the top. "Talk to the church quietly," and another below it. "Ask Dr. Porter to estimate model family." When he finished, the page looked like what it was, a plan that would carry them a few more steps. He closed the laptop and the house returned to ordinary sounds. Ordinary was not victory, but it was where victories could be built. Michael asked the pastor for a quiet minute after evening prayer. He kept his voice low, respectful. He explained they were trying to protect Robert, not embarrass the church. The pastor nodded, promised to preserve the logs, and wrote a single name on a folded card. Frank Dawson. Friendly usher, helps with the stream, sits 2 pews behind Robert. On the drive home, Michael's phone buzzed. No subject, same anonymous address, 4 words, not just the money, check the county. There was a redacted screenshot, attached parcel number, Robert's address, and a queued document listed as a quitclaim deed to Cedar Oak Holdings, LLC. Sarah searched the county portal from Robert's kitchen table. Her mouth tightened. Draft deed. Mobile notary on the calendar for tomorrow morning. The signature block uses a composite, same style as the forged authorization. Robert stared at the wall clock. "My house," he said. "They want my house," Agent Cole called, as if he had felt the sentence land. "Don't confront anyone at church," he said. "We'll move to intercept the notary and lock the file. I'll trace the LLC and the filing agent. If they've cloned voice once, they could try mortgage or beneficiary changes next. Freeze what you can, but do not engage." A moment later, another call came in. "Title Services," a bright voice said. "Just confirming tomorrow's signing with Mr. Robert Miller." Michael asked for a callback number. Asked 3 soft questions and let the silence do the work. The voice nudged, "Use the same clean phrases from the liquidation script for your convenient standard confirmation transfer proceeds," and hung up when he asked for the notary's license. Michael saved the recording and forwarded it to Cole and Dr. Porter. They drove to church for the late service because Robert would not give his pew to fear. In the corridor, Frank gave him the same warm nod, asked after his back, said he'd pray for rest. Michael watched the way Frank's hands folded steady, practiced. The pastor texted 1 line, "Logs preserved." Frank's account downloaded the scripture clip twice last week. Cole's message arrived as the final hymn faded. The LLC's filing agent matched a contact in Avery Knox's threads. The co-working fob pinged 15 minutes after the live stream download. The same device fingerprint had touched a remote notary platform. Michael felt the night tilt again. They weren't just after a retirement account, he said to the listener, to anyone who had ever loved an elder. They were after a man's name, a roof, a life. Tomorrow's appointment ticked closer in his head like a metronome. If you found this story interesting, please leave a comment to let us know, and don't forget to share it with others. Remember to subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming videos. Thank you for watching.